The year is 1817, and England basked in the glory of its recent victory at Waterloo. The Regency era had transformed London into a glittering showcase of power, where the aristocracy displayed their wealth through elaborate social rituals that could make or break reputations in a single evening. Within the mahogany-paneled drawing rooms of Mayfair mansions, marriage was not merely a union of hearts, but a calculated chess game where titles, fortunes, and political alliances hung in the balance. Westminster Abbey stood majestically against the grey London sky, its Gothic spires reaching toward heaven as carriages lined the cobblestone streets for nearly half a mile. Today marked the wedding of the decade, an event that had consumed the attention of every member of high society for months. The bride was Lady Evangeline Ashworth, daughter of the Duke of Ravenshollow, whose lineage traced back to the Norman conquest. Her dowry alone could have funded a small war, and her beauty had been celebrated in drawing rooms from Edinburgh to Bath. The groom, Lord Sebastian Blackthorne, Earl of Whitmore, commanded equal admiration for entirely different reasons. At 32 years of age, he possessed the kind of dark, brooding handsomeness that made society mothers clutch their pearls while secretly hoping he might glance toward their unmarried daughters. His estate in Yorkshire encompassed 20,000 acres of the finest farmland in England, and his investments in the East India Company had tripled his already considerable fortune. More importantly, he enjoyed the personal friendship of Prince Regent George himself, a connection that opened doors throughout the highest echelons of power. Inside the Abbey, 500 of England's most influential families had gathered, their silk gowns rustling like autumn leaves as they settled into pews arranged according to strict protocols of precedence. Duchesses wore tiaras that caught the morning light streaming through stained glass windows, while marquises adjusted their ceremonial swords and exchanged knowing glances about the political implications of this union. The air was thick with the scent of orange blossoms, white roses, and the subtle perfumes imported from Paris despite the ongoing tensions with France. Lady Evangeline stood in the vestry, surrounded by 6 bridesmaids dressed in complementary shades of pale blue silk that emphasized her own radiant beauty. Her wedding gown was a masterpiece of Regency fashion, crafted from the finest ivory silk with intricate beadwork that had taken seamstresses 6 months to complete. The Empire waistline, set just below her bust, was adorned with seed pearls arranged in delicate floral patterns, while the long train flowed behind her like liquid moonlight. Her dark auburn hair was arranged in an elaborate chignon crowned by a diamond tiara that had belonged to 5 generations of Ashworth brides. But beneath the ethereal beauty of the moment, something darker stirred in Lady Evangeline's emerald eyes. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted her lace gloves, and her usually composed demeanor carried an undercurrent of tension that her closest companions attributed to typical bridal nerves. None of them could have imagined that within the hidden folds of her bouquet lay a document that would transform this celebration into the scandal of the century. The wedding preparations had begun before dawn, with an army of servants transforming the Abbey into a garden of earthly delights. White roses from the Duke's greenhouses adorned every available surface, their petals scattered along the crimson carpet that stretched from the entrance to the altar. Massive arrangements of lilies and orange blossoms flanked the chancel, while smaller bouquets tied with ivory ribbons marked each pew. The effect was nothing short of magical, creating an atmosphere where fairy tales seemed not only possible but inevitable. Lord Sebastian waited at the altar with his best man, Colonel James Worthington, a decorated war hero whose presence added an air of masculine gravitas to the proceedings. Sebastian's mourning coat was cut from the finest black wool, its high collar and fitted silhouette emphasizing his commanding presence. His dark hair was perfectly styled in the fashionable manner, and the Blackthorne family signet ring caught the light as he clasped his hands behind his back. To observers, he appeared the very picture of a confident bridegroom, though those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tension in his jaw. The organ began its majestic processional, and 600 heads turned toward the Abbey doors as the first bridesmaids began their stately progress down the aisle. Each young lady was a vision of aristocratic breeding, their careful steps timed to the sacred music that filled the ancient stone walls. Behind them came Lady Evangeline's younger sister, Lady Margaret, serving as maid of honor in a gown of deeper blue silk that complemented her fair complexion and golden hair. Finally, the moment arrived that every guest had been anticipating. The massive doors opened once more, and Lady Evangeline appeared on the arm of her father, the Duke of Ravenshollow. He was a man whose very presence commanded respect, his military bearing evident despite his advancing years. His dress uniform, resplendent with medals earned in service to the crown, created a striking contrast to his daughter's ethereal beauty. Together, they began the long walk that would ostensibly unite two of England's most powerful families. The assembled nobility rose as one, the rustle of silk and the gentle clink of jewelry creating a symphony of anticipation. Whispered comments passed between mothers and daughters about the perfection of the bride's appearance, while gentlemen nodded approvingly at the obvious prosperity such a union would bring to both families. None of them suspected that hidden within the bride's trembling hands lay the power to destroy not just this wedding, but the reputation of one of their most respected peers. 6 months earlier, Lady Evangeline Ashworth had been the epitome of everything a Regency lady should aspire to become. At 22 years of age, she possessed not only remarkable beauty, but also an education that rivaled many gentlemen of her acquaintance. Fluent in French and Italian, accomplished on the pianoforte, and well-versed in the philosophical writings that were fashionable among the intellectual elite, she was considered one of the most eligible young women in England. Her father, the Duke of Ravenshollow, had received no fewer than 12 formal offers for her hand, each from suitors whose credentials would have satisfied the most demanding social climber. Yet none of these worthy gentlemen had captured Evangeline's heart until the evening she first encountered Lord Sebastian Blackthorne at Lady Pemberton's autumn ball. The ballroom at Pemberton House was renowned throughout London for its spectacular crystal chandeliers, and the way candlelight reflected off the gold leaf that adorned every available surface. Evangeline had been partnered with young Lord Fitzwilliam for the first country dance when she noticed a tall, dark figure watching her from across the room with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Sebastian Blackthorne possessed the kind of dangerous charm that made sensible young ladies forget their proper upbringing. His dark eyes seemed to see directly into one's soul, while his sardonic smile suggested he harbored secrets that would both fascinate and terrify those bold enough to discover them. When he finally approached her father to request an introduction, Evangeline felt as though her carefully ordered world had suddenly tilted on its axis. Their first dance together was a waltz, recently imported from Vienna despite the initial scandal it had caused among more conservative members of society. The courtship that followed was everything a romantic young woman could have desired. Sebastian proved to be an entertaining correspondent, his letters filled with witty observations about London society and passionate declarations of his growing attachment. He sent flowers daily, always choosing varieties that carried specific meanings in the elaborate language of bouquets that governed such communications. Red roses for passionate love, white jasmine for amiability, and yellow daffodils for regard were carefully arranged by his servants and delivered to Ravenshollow House with clockwork precision. Their engagement was announced at Christmas, during the Duke's annual winter ball, an event that traditionally marked the unofficial beginning of the winter social season. The ballroom at Ravenshollow House could accommodate 300 guests comfortably, its walls lined with portraits of distinguished ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to approve of this advantageous match. Sebastian's proposal had been everything Evangeline had dreamed of, delivered in the conservatory among her father's prized orchids while snow fell gently outside the glass walls. But beneath the surface of this fairy tale romance, darker currents were already beginning to flow. It began with small inconsistencies in Sebastian's stories about his past, details that shifted slightly from one telling to the next. Initially, Evangeline attributed these discrepancies to the natural tendency of memory to reshape events over time. However, her concern deepened when she noticed that servants in his household seemed unusually fearful in his presence, their eyes downcast and their responses to his commands delivered with a haste that suggested more than mere respect. The first concrete evidence of something amiss came through her friendship with Mrs. Catherine Hartwell, the widow of a naval officer who had been killed at Trafalgar. Catherine possessed a network of connections throughout London's servant class, relationships forged through years of treating domestic staff with unusual kindness and respect. It was through these connections that disturbing rumors about Lord Sebastian's Yorkshire estate began to reach London's drawing rooms. Whispered conversations that spoke of unexplained disappearances, and local magistrates who seemed curiously reluctant to investigate certain complaints. Lady Evangeline's education had included more than the typical accomplishments expected of a duke's daughter. Her governess, Miss Penelope Ashford, was an unconventional woman who believed that ignorance was not a virtue, regardless of one's gender or social position. Under Miss Ashford's tutelage, Evangeline had learned to think critically, to question assumptions, and to value truth above convenience. These lessons served her well, as she began to investigate the man she was pledged to marry. The investigation began innocently enough, with casual inquiries during social calls and attention paid to conversations that mentioned Yorkshire or Lord Sebastian's business interests. Gradually, a pattern emerged that chilled Evangeline to her very core. Stories of tenant farmers whose daughters had vanished without explanation, of debts that were forgiven in exchange for silence, and of magistrates whose own financial difficulties had been mysteriously resolved after particularly sensitive cases were quietly dismissed. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source. Lady Margaret, Evangeline's younger sister, had developed a romantic attachment to Captain Thomas Morrison, a junior officer in His Majesty's Navy who had served with distinction in the Mediterranean campaigns. Captain Morrison was possessed of more integrity than discretion, and when Margaret confided her sister's concerns about her intended bridegroom, he used his military connections to investigate further. What he discovered was evidence of a systematic pattern of corruption that reached from Yorkshire's remote moors to the highest levels of London society. The documentation that Captain Morrison provided was both comprehensive and damning. Lord Sebastian Blackthorne was not merely a gentleman with questionable business practices, but the central figure in a network that traded in human misery. Young women from impoverished families throughout Yorkshire had been disappearing for nearly 5 years. Their families told they had found positions in London households that required complete discretion. Instead, these innocent girls were being transported to private establishments that catered to the darkest appetites of wealthy men who believed their social position placed them above moral law. More shocking still was the evidence that Sebastian's friendship with Prince Regent George was not based on mutual interests in art and culture, as society believed, but on shared participation in activities that would have destroyed both men if exposed. The prince's notorious appetites were well known among the inner circle, but the extent to which Sebastian facilitated these desires went far beyond mere procurement. He had created an entire shadow economy built on the exploitation of those society deemed expendable. Armed with this terrible knowledge, Lady Evangeline faced an impossible choice. She could remain silent, marry Sebastian as planned, and become complicit in his crimes through her position as his wife. Alternatively, she could expose him, destroying not only his reputation but potentially bringing down members of the royal family, and countless other powerful men, whose names appeared in Captain Morrison's carefully compiled evidence. The social and political ramifications would be enormous, reaching far beyond a single wedding ceremony. The decision crystallized during a private dinner at Blackthorne House, Sebastian's London residence, just 2 weeks before their scheduled wedding. As they dined alone in his sumptuous dining room, surrounded by artwork that she now realized had been acquired through blood money, Sebastian made casual mention of a new addition to his household staff. A young girl from Yorkshire, he explained with apparent casualness, whose family had been most grateful for his assistance in finding her suitable employment. The girl's description matched perfectly with one of the missing women detailed in Captain Morrison's report. That evening, as Sebastian's carriage returned her to Ravenshollow House, Lady Evangeline made her choice. She would not simply expose Sebastian's crimes. She would orchestrate his downfall in a manner that would serve as a warning to others who might consider following his path. The wedding would proceed as planned, but instead of vows of eternal love, London society would witness justice served with all the ceremony due to such a momentous occasion. The 2 weeks following Lady Evangeline's terrible discovery passed in a whirlwind of careful planning and deadly deception. By day, she maintained the perfect facade of a blissful bride-to-be, attending final dress fittings, approving floral arrangements, and receiving the endless stream of well-wishers who called at Ravenshollow House to offer their congratulations. By night, however, she worked with Captain Morrison and a small circle of trusted allies to ensure that Sebastian's crimes would be exposed in a manner that would prevent his escape and serve as a warning to others involved in his network. The complexity of their plan required the cooperation of several key figures within London's power structure. Captain Morrison's military connections proved invaluable in reaching Colonel Sir Henry Bradshaw, the officer responsible for coordinating security for events involving members of the royal family. Colonel Bradshaw was a man whose integrity was legendary throughout the army, and when presented with evidence of crimes that touched the royal household itself, he agreed to provide the necessary support for Evangeline's dramatic revelation. Meanwhile, Lady Evangeline's father, the Duke of Ravenshollow, proved to be a more formidable ally than she had initially dared to hope. When she finally confided the truth about Sebastian's character, the Duke's military training and political acumen immediately grasped both the magnitude of the crimes and the delicate nature of the situation. His initial fury at the deception gradually transformed into cold calculation as he realized that his daughter's plan offered the best opportunity to expose the corruption while protecting their family's reputation. The Duke's connections within the House of Lords proved crucial in ensuring that the legal framework was in place to support their actions. Lord Chancellor Eldon, despite his reputation for conservative politics, was a man who valued the rule of law above personal convenience. When approached through careful intermediaries with evidence of crimes that threatened the very foundations of English society, he agreed to ensure that proper warrants were prepared, and that magistrates would be standing by to take Sebastian into custody immediately following his public exposure. Simultaneously, preparations continued for what all of London believed would be the wedding of the century. The guest list read like a directory of British power, with representatives from every major noble family, high-ranking military officers, prominent members of Parliament, and even several foreign dignitaries who happened to be visiting London. The irony was not lost on Lady Evangeline that Sebastian's own social prominence would ensure the largest possible audience for his downfall. The wedding gown fittings provided perfect cover for secret meetings with her co-conspirators. While seamstresses pinned delicate lace and adjusted the drape of silk, Captain Morrison and Colonel Bradshaw refined the details of their operation. The timing had to be precise, the evidence carefully organized, and contingency plans developed for every possible complication. Sebastian's network included powerful men who would not hesitate to use violence to protect their interests, making security arrangements a critical component of their planning. Lady Evangeline's performance during this period required acting skills that would have impressed the finest performers on Drury Lane's stage. She attended social functions on Sebastian's arm, smiling adoringly as he accepted congratulations on his forthcoming marriage. She listened to his plans for their honeymoon journey to Italy with apparent enthusiasm, all while knowing that instead of Roman ruins and Venetian canals, his destination would be a prison cell. The strain of maintaining this deception was enormous, but her determination to see justice done sustained her through the most difficult moments. The evidence against Sebastian continued to accumulate as Captain Morrison's investigation expanded. A coded ledger discovered in Sebastian's study documented transactions that clearly showed payments to ship captains, corrupt magistrates, and the proprietors of establishments throughout England and continental Europe. More damning still were letters in Sebastian's own hand that provided explicit instructions for the acquisition and transportation of young women, treating human beings as mere commodities to be bought, sold, and consumed according to the whims of his wealthy clients. Perhaps the most heartbreaking element of the evidence was the personal testimony of 3 young women who had managed to escape from Sebastian's network. hidden in safe houses provided by abolitionists who had redirected their efforts from fighting slavery in distant colonies to combating human trafficking in their own country. These women provided first-hand accounts of systematic brutality that went far beyond anything Evangeline had initially imagined. Their courage in agreeing to testify, despite the social ostracism they would inevitably face, strengthened her resolve to see their tormentor brought to justice. The wedding rehearsal, held the evening before the ceremony, provided the final opportunity to ensure that every detail of their plan was perfectly coordinated. Westminster Abbey was filled with the closest family members and wedding party participants, all blissfully unaware that they were rehearsing for a drama far different from the one they expected to witness. As Evangeline practiced her processional walk down the aisle, she mentally rehearsed the words she would speak that would transform a wedding into a trial. Sebastian's behavior during the rehearsal dinner gave no indication that he suspected anything amiss. Held at Blackthorn House, the intimate gathering of 40 guests was treated to the finest French wines and delicacies prepared by Sebastian's renowned chef. Sebastian himself was charming and attentive, playing the role of devoted bridegroom with consummate skill. His toast to his bride was particularly touching, speaking of the happiness she had brought into his life and his anticipation of their future together. The irony of these words, delivered just hours before his public exposure, was almost unbearable for those who knew what the morning would bring. The final preparations took place in the early hours of the wedding day itself. Captain Morrison and his trusted sergeants positioned themselves throughout Westminster Abbey, dressed as gentlemen guests, but armed with both weapons and warrants. Colonel Bradshaw coordinated with the Royal Guard to ensure that additional security was discreetly deployed around the church and surrounding streets. Lord Chancellor Eldon reviewed the legal documents one final time, confirming that every procedure had been followed correctly to ensure that Sebastian's arrest would be legally unassailable. As dawn broke over London, Lady Evangeline knelt in the chapel at Ravenshollow House, praying for the strength to carry through with her plan, and the wisdom to ensure that justice was served without unnecessary destruction. She thought of the young women whose voices had been silenced by Sebastian's cruelty, and of the many others who might be saved if his network was dismantled. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but so was her determination to transform what should have been the happiest day of her life into a moment that would be remembered as a triumph of justice over corruption. The morning preparations proceeded exactly as they had been rehearsed, with one crucial exception. Hidden within the folds of Lady Evangeline's wedding bouquet, carefully secured with silk ribbons that matched her gown, was a leather portfolio containing the complete evidence of Sebastian's crimes. As her maid arranged the flowers one final time, checking that every white rose and orange blossom was perfectly positioned, neither woman spoke of the deadly secret hidden among the blooms. The time for words had passed, now only action remained. The magnificent processional at Westminster Abbey unfolded exactly as London society had anticipated, with one crucial difference that none of the assembled guests could have imagined. Lady Evangeline moved down the aisle with the grace of a queen proceeding to her coronation, her silk train flowing behind her like liquid starlight, while 600 of England's most influential citizens rose to honor her passage. The morning light streaming through the ancient stained glass windows created rainbow patterns across her wedding gown, and the scent of orange blossoms filled the sacred space with an almost intoxicating sweetness. Yet beneath this scene of perfect aristocratic pageantry, another drama was quietly unfolding. Captain Morrison and his carefully selected men occupied strategic positions throughout the abbey, their military bearing allowing them to blend seamlessly among the assembled nobility, while maintaining clear sightlines to their target. Colonel Bradshaw stood near the altar in his dress uniform, ostensibly present as a friend of the groom, but actually coordinating the final details of an operation that would shock London society to its core. Lord Sebastian awaited his bride at the altar with apparent confidence, his dark eyes reflecting the candlelight as he watched her approach. His morning coat was perfectly tailored, emphasizing his commanding presence, while the Blackthorn family's signet ring caught the light as he adjusted his white gloves. To the assembled guests, he appeared every inch the perfect English gentleman, a man whose lineage and accomplishments made him worthy of the Duke's daughter. None of them suspected that within minutes, this paragon of aristocratic virtue would be revealed as something far more sinister. Archbishop Cranston, resplendent in his ceremonial robes, had officiated at royal weddings and the marriages of countless noble families throughout his distinguished career. His voice carried easily through the Abbey's soaring spaces as he began the ancient ritual that had united English aristocrats for centuries. The familiar words of the Anglican wedding service resonated with tradition and authority, lending an air of sacred solemnity to proceedings that were about to become anything but traditional. Lady Evangeline took her place beside Sebastian with outward composure that belied the thundering of her heart. As her father placed her hand in Sebastian's before stepping back to his position in the front pew, she felt the portfolio hidden within her bouquet pressing against her side like a weapon waiting to be drawn. The moment she had planned for 2 weeks was finally at hand, and with it would come either justice or catastrophe for everyone present. The opening portions of the ceremony proceeded without incident, the Archbishop's melodious voice leading the congregation through prayers and readings that emphasized the sanctity of marriage and the duties of husband and wife. Sebastian's responses were delivered with perfect clarity and apparent sincerity, his deep voice carrying easily through the Abbey as he professed his intention to love, honor, and protect his bride. The irony of these vows, spoken by a man who had systematically brutalized innocent women, was almost unbearable for those who knew the truth. When Archbishop Cranston reached the point in the ceremony where he traditionally asked whether anyone present knew of any lawful impediment to the marriage, an expectant hush fell over the assembly. This portion of the service was typically a mere formality, a ceremonial nod to ancient tradition that no one expected to produce any actual response. The silence stretched for several heartbeats, filled only with the soft whisper of silk gowns and the distant sound of London traffic beyond the Abbey walls. It was then that Lady Evangeline spoke, her clear voice carrying through the sacred space with crystalline precision that commanded immediate attention. Instead of remaining silent, she stepped forward slightly and addressed the Archbishop directly, her words carefully chosen for maximum impact while maintaining the dignity appropriate to her station and the solemnity of the setting. "Your Grace," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "I must speak to a matter that bears directly upon the character of the man I am pledged to marry. Before God and this assembly, I cannot in good conscience proceed with these vows without addressing crimes that demand justice." The reaction was immediate and electric. A collective gasp rose from the assembled guests, followed by an urgent whispering that filled the Abbey like the sound of wind through autumn leaves. Sebastian's face drained of color, though he maintained his composure with the skill of a man accustomed to dangerous situations. Archbishop Cranston looked genuinely confused, clearly struggling to understand what was happening within the sacred ritual he had performed countless times before. Lady Evangeline continued, her voice growing stronger as she embraced the role she had rehearsed so carefully. "The man who stands beside me is not the honorable gentleman that society believes him to be. Lord Sebastian Blackthorne stands accused of crimes against innocent women, of trafficking in human misery, and of corruption that reaches to the highest levels of our government. I have in my possession documented evidence of these crimes, gathered by brave individuals who value justice above social convenience." With deliberate ceremony, she withdrew the leather portfolio from her bouquet, the white roses and orange blossoms scattering across the altar steps as she held the evidence high for all to see. The symbolism was powerful and intentional, the pure flowers of her wedding bouquet giving way to the harsh reality of documented evil. Sebastian made a sudden movement as if to snatch the documents from her hands, but Captain Morrison and his men were already in motion, surrounding the altar with military precision that left no doubt about their intentions. These documents detail the systematic abduction and trafficking of young women from Yorkshire and other counties, facilitated by Lord Sebastian through a network of corrupt officials and violent criminals. His victims were told they were being offered positions in respectable London households, but instead were transported to establishments that catered to the darkest appetites of wealthy men who believed their social position placed them above moral law. The abbey erupted in chaos as the full implications of Lady Evangeline's accusations became clear. Some guests rose from their pews in shock and outrage, while others seemed frozen in disbelief. Several women fainted and were attended by their companions, while gentlemen shouted questions and demands for explanation that created a cacophony of voices beneath the ancient stone arches. Archbishop Cranston, his face pale with shock, attempted to restore order while struggling to understand his role in this unprecedented situation. "Lady Evangeline," he began uncertainly, "these are grave accusations that surely require careful investigation rather than public declaration. Perhaps this matter should be addressed through proper legal channels, rather than within the sacred confines of this wedding ceremony." But Lady Evangeline was not finished. Drawing upon reserves of courage she had not known she possessed, she turned to face the assembled guests directly, her voice carrying clearly over the din of confused voices. "Your Grace, esteemed guests, I stand before you not as a hysterical bride overcome by wedding day nerves, but as a daughter of England who refuses to become complicit in crimes against her countrywomen. The evidence I hold has been reviewed by military officers, legal authorities, and moral leaders who agree that immediate action is required." Colonel Bradshaw stepped forward then, his uniform and bearing commanding immediate respect from the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in the authoritative voice of a career military officer, "I am Colonel Sir Henry Bradshaw, and I am here today on official business related to crimes against the Crown. Lord Sebastian Blackthorne, you are under arrest for high treason, human trafficking, corruption of government officials, and numerous other charges that will be formally presented to you following your detention." The royal guards who had been discreetly positioned throughout the abbey now revealed themselves, their red uniforms in disciplined formation creating a stark contrast to the elegant wedding decorations. Sebastian, realizing that escape was impossible, finally abandoned his facade of innocence. His handsome features twisted into a snarl of rage and desperation as he turned upon Lady Evangeline with venomous fury. "You foolish, naive child," he hissed, his cultured voice now revealing the cruelty that had always lurked beneath his charming exterior. "You have no idea of the forces you are challenging. The men whose names appear in those documents will not allow this exposure to proceed. Your righteousness will destroy you and everyone you claim to protect." But his threats fell upon deaf ears as the royal guards moved to secure him. The sight of Sebastian Blackthorne, Earl of Whitmore, being placed in chains within Westminster Abbey created a scene that would be discussed in drawing rooms throughout England for decades to come. Lady Evangeline watched with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow as the man she had once believed herself to love was led away to face justice for his crimes. The transformation was complete. What had begun as the wedding of the century had become the trial of the century, conducted not in a courthouse but within the sacred walls of England's most venerable abbey. Lady Evangeline stood amidst the chaos, her wedding gown now a symbol not of romantic union but of moral courage, her bouquet scattered but her principles intact. The immediate aftermath of Sebastian's arrest transformed Westminster Abbey into a scene of barely controlled pandemonium that tested the very foundations of English social order. 600 guests, representing the cream of British aristocracy, found themselves witnesses to an event that challenged everything they believed about their own social circle. The carefully maintained facade of respectability that governed their world had been shattered as completely as if a cannonball had crashed through the abbey's ancient walls. Duke Ravenshollow moved swiftly to protect his daughter, positioning himself between Lady Evangeline and the crowd of confused, angry, and frightened nobles who pressed forward with demands for explanation. His military bearing and natural authority commanded respect even in these unprecedented circumstances, though his own shock at the morning's events was evident in the tight line of his jaw and the protective way he placed his hand on Evangeline's shoulder. Archbishop Cranston, recovering from his initial bewilderment, began the delicate task of clearing the abbey while maintaining some semblance of dignity for all involved. His voice, trained to carry across vast congregations, rose above the chaos as he called for calm and ordered withdrawal. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with as much authority as he could muster, "these proceedings are concluded. I ask that you retire to your homes in good order, and allow the proper authorities to address the serious matters that have been brought to light." But many guests were not prepared to depart quietly. Lord Pemberton, a close friend of Sebastian's whose own reputation now hung in the balance, pushed through the crowd toward Lady Evangeline with obvious intent to confront her. His face was flushed with rage, and what appeared to be genuine fear as he demanded to know the source of her information and the extent of her evidence. Before he could reach her, however, Captain Morrison and two of his sergeants intervened, their military precision creating an effective barrier while maintaining the appearance of courtesy due to a peer of the realm. The social implications of the morning's revelations began to ripple outward like circles from a stone dropped in still water. Wives whispered urgently to their husbands about business dealings and social connections that might now require careful reconsideration. Mothers pulled their unmarried daughters closer, suddenly aware that the charming gentleman of their acquaintance might harbor secrets far darker than gambling debts or drinking problems. The very foundation of trust upon which aristocratic society was built had been shaken to its core. Lady Margaret Ashworth, serving as her sister's maid of honor, proved invaluable during these crucial moments. Despite her youth and the shocking nature of the revelations, she maintained remarkable composure while helping to organize their withdrawal from the Abbey. Her romantic attachment to Captain Morrison had given her advanced knowledge of the morning's plan, though even she had not fully grasped the magnitude of what would unfold. Now, seeing the courage her sister had displayed, she felt a fierce pride that overshadowed her natural fear of the consequences they would all face. Colonel Bradshaw worked efficiently to secure the scene and ensure that all evidence was properly collected and preserved. His men had been thoroughly briefed on the sensitivity of their mission, understanding that any procedural errors could be exploited by Sebastian's powerful allies to challenge the arrests and suppress the investigation. The leather portfolio containing the documented evidence was formally transferred to his custody with the same ceremony that might accompany the changing of a military guard, emphasizing the official nature of the proceedings. As news of the dramatic arrest spread beyond the Abbey walls, London itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what would come next. Servants dispatched urgent messages to their employers who had not attended the wedding, while those who had been present found themselves the center of attention at every subsequent social gathering. The story grew in the telling, with each repetition adding new details about Lady Evangeline's courage and Sebastian's alleged crimes. The political ramifications began to manifest almost immediately. Members of Parliament whose names appeared in Sebastian's documents found themselves facing difficult questions from colleagues who had previously considered them above suspicion. The Prince Regent himself, though not directly implicated in the most serious charges, faced the uncomfortable reality that his friendship with Sebastian would inevitably be scrutinized by those seeking to understand the full scope of the corruption that had been exposed. Lady Evangeline, once the center of admiring attention as London's most eligible bride, now found herself in the far more complex position of a woman who had chosen justice over personal happiness. The immediate reactions from other members of society were mixed, ranging from admiration for her courage to criticism of her methods. Some argued that such serious matters should have been handled discreetly through proper legal channels, while others praised her for ensuring that powerful criminals could not escape justice through behind-the-scenes negotiations. The Duke of Ravensshallow's political acumen proved invaluable as he began the delicate task of managing the crisis while protecting his family's interests. His connections throughout the government and military establishments allowed him to coordinate with authorities who were sympathetic to their cause, ensuring that the investigation would proceed with all necessary resources and protection for witnesses. At the same time, he worked to minimize the damage to innocent family members and servants who might be caught up in the controversy through no fault of their own. Captain Morrison's role in the investigation became public knowledge within hours of Sebastian's arrest, transforming him overnight from a junior naval officer into one of the most talked-about men in London. His integrity and courage in pursuing the investigation despite the potential damage to his own career earned him respect from unexpected quarters, while his romantic attachment to Lady Margaret added a secondary romance subplot to a story that already contained enough drama for several novels. The legal proceedings that followed moved with unprecedented speed, driven by public interest and the quality of evidence that had been assembled. Sebastian's attempts to claim diplomatic immunity through his connections to foreign governments were quickly dismissed, while his lawyers' efforts to suppress the evidence on procedural grounds were overruled by judges who recognized the gravity of the charges. The systematic nature of his crimes, documented in his own handwriting, made denial impossible and plea bargaining unlikely. Meanwhile, the investigation expanded to encompass other members of Sebastian's network, leading to additional arrests throughout England and Scotland. Corrupt magistrates found themselves facing the same legal system they had manipulated for personal gain, while ship captains and establishment proprietors discovered that their powerful patrons could no longer protect them from justice. The scope of the corruption that was revealed shocked even those who had considered themselves worldly and sophisticated. For Lady Evangeline herself, the immediate aftermath brought a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and profound sadness for the future she had sacrificed in service of a greater cause. The wedding gown that should have symbolized the beginning of a new life instead marked the end of her innocence about the world she had been born into. Yet as letters of support began to arrive from women throughout England who had heard of her courage, she began to understand that her sacrifice had opened possibilities for change that went far beyond her personal situation. The social season that should have celebrated her marriage instead became dominated by discussions of reform and accountability that challenged long-held assumptions about privilege and power. Lady Evangeline found herself at the center of a movement she had never intended to create, but which seemed to offer hope for a future where justice might be possible even for those born without titles or fortunes. The winter months following the scandal that became known throughout England as the Wedding Day Reckoning brought profound changes to both London society and the individuals whose lives had been forever altered by Lady Evangeline's courageous stand. The immediate shock and chaos had given way to a more deliberate process of reform and renewal that touched every level of English social and political life. Lord Sebastian Blackthorne's trial became the most closely watched legal proceeding of the decade, drawing spectators from across Europe who came to witness justice being served against one of England's most privileged criminals. The evidence presented was so comprehensive and damning that even his most skilled legal advocates could mount no meaningful defense. The systematic nature of his crimes, documented in meticulous detail through his own correspondence and financial records, painted a picture of corruption that extended far beyond what society had initially believed possible. The trial proceedings revealed the full scope of Sebastian's criminal enterprise, which had operated for nearly 7 years under the protection of corrupt officials, and the indifference of a society that preferred not to examine too closely the sources of certain entertainments. Over 60 young women had been victimized by his network, with many more narrowly escaping similar fates through circumstances that could only be described as miraculous. The testimony of survivors, delivered with courage that inspired admiration throughout the courtroom, provided harrowing details of systematic brutality that left few observers unmoved. Sebastian himself maintained a facade of aristocratic disdain throughout the proceedings, refusing to acknowledge the legitimacy of charges brought by what he termed hysterical women and ambitious social climbers. His arrogance and complete lack of remorse only served to strengthen the resolve of those seeking justice, while demonstrating to the public the depth of moral corruption that had been hidden beneath his charming exterior. When the inevitable guilty verdict was delivered, he received it with the same cold indifference he had shown his victims, confirming that Lady Evangeline's assessment of his character had been entirely accurate. The sentence imposed reflected both the gravity of his crimes and the court's determination to send a clear message about the consequences of exploiting the vulnerable. Transportation to the penal colonies in Australia, followed by 25 years of hard labor, ensured that Sebastian would never again be in a position to harm innocent women. His titles were formally revoked by the Crown, his estates confiscated to provide compensation for his victims, and his name struck from all official records of the peerage. The Earl of Whitmore ceased to exist as if he had never been born into the aristocracy he had so thoroughly dishonored. Lady Evangeline's role in exposing Sebastian's crimes transformed her from a duke's daughter seeking a suitable marriage into something far more significant. A symbol of moral courage that inspired women throughout England and beyond. Letters arrived daily at Ravenshollow House from women of all social classes who had found strength in her example to confront injustices in their own lives. Governesses reported improved treatment from employers who feared public exposure, while merchants discovered that their female customers had become more demanding of ethical business practices. The broader investigation that grew from Sebastian's arrest ultimately led to reforms that strengthened protections for vulnerable women throughout British society. Parliament passed legislation that improved oversight of employment agencies, increased penalties for human trafficking, and created mechanisms for reporting corruption among local magistrates. The Prince Regent himself, chastened by his association with Sebastian, and aware of the damage to royal prestige, publicly endorsed these reforms while quietly distancing himself from other questionable associates. Captain Morrison's courage in pursuing the initial investigation earned him promotion to major, an assignment to a prestigious posting that reflected the high regard in which he was now held by his superiors. More importantly for his personal happiness, the scandal's resolution cleared the way for his marriage to Lady Margaret Ashworth, a union that the Duke now viewed as both appropriate and advisable. Their wedding, held the following spring in the chapel at Ravenshollow Estate, was a deliberately modest affair that emphasized genuine affection over social display. The Duke of Ravenshollow himself emerged from the crisis with his reputation enhanced rather than damaged, his handling of the situation demonstrating the kind of principled leadership that British society desperately needed. His support for his daughter's actions, despite the personal and political risks involved, earned him respect from quarters that had previously viewed him as merely another privileged aristocrat more concerned with maintaining his position than serving the greater good. His subsequent advocacy for social reforms helped bridge the gap between progressive and conservative factions within Parliament. For Lady Evangeline personally, the months following the trial brought a period of reflection and gradual healing from the trauma of discovering the man she had loved was capable of such evil. The loss of her innocence about the world was profound and permanent, but it was gradually replaced by a more mature understanding of her own power to effect positive change. The marriage proposals that began arriving within 6 months of Sebastian's conviction came from men who admired her courage rather than merely her beauty and fortune, offering the possibility of relationships based on mutual respect rather than social convenience. Among these suitors was Lord William Hartwell, younger brother of the naval widow Mrs. Catherine Hartwell, who had first alerted Lady Evangeline to the disturbing rumors about Sebastian. William had spent 5 years in India as a military administrator, returning to England just as the scandal was reaching its conclusion. His overseas service had given him a broader perspective on justice and morality that made him uniquely capable of understanding and appreciating what Evangeline had accomplished. Their courtship, when it began the following autumn, was conducted with a deliberate pace that reflected their mutual desire to build a relationship on the strongest possible foundation. William's letters demonstrated both intellectual depth and genuine admiration for Evangeline's character, while his behavior in social settings showed consistent respect for her opinions and independence. Unlike Sebastian's passionate but manipulative courtship, William's approach emphasized partnership and shared values over romantic intensity. The engagement announcement, when it came after a year of careful courtship, was greeted with widespread approval from a society that had learned to value substance over surface appeal. Lady Evangeline's choice of a man known for his integrity and commitment to justice was seen as validation of the principles she had demonstrated so dramatically at Westminster Abbey. Their wedding, planned for the following summer, would be a celebration of genuine love that had grown from mutual respect and shared commitment to making the world a better place. The broader impact of the wedding day reckoning continued to reverberate throughout English society for years to come. Social reforms that had been languishing in parliamentary committees suddenly gained momentum, as public awareness of systematic exploitation created pressure for meaningful change. The investigation of Sebastian's network led to improvements in law enforcement training, better coordination between local and national authorities, and increased funding for organizations that assisted victims of trafficking and exploitation. Perhaps most importantly, the scandal challenged the assumption that social position provided immunity from moral accountability. The sight of a peer of the realm being led away in chains from Westminster Abbey became a powerful symbol that justice was possible even when it required confronting the most privileged members of society. Women throughout England drew inspiration from Lady Evangeline's example, finding courage to speak out against injustices they had previously endured in silence. As the second anniversary of her dramatic wedding day revelation approached, Lady Evangeline reflected on the strange turns her life had taken, and the unexpected ways in which personal tragedy had been transformed into public triumph. The naive young woman who had walked down the aisle at Westminster Abbey believing she was about to marry the man of her dreams had been forever changed by the discovery of his true nature. But the woman who emerged from that crisis possessed strength and purpose she had never imagined possible. Standing in the morning room at Ravenshollow House, reading letters from women whose lives had been improved by the reforms her courage had helped inspire, Lady Evangeline understood that she had found something far more valuable than the romantic love she had originally sought. She had discovered her own power to make a difference in the world, and in doing so had opened the door to a future filled with possibilities she was only beginning to explore. The English countryside beyond her window was awakening to another spring, its green fields and blooming orchards offering promise of renewal and growth. Like the land itself, Lady Evangeline had endured a harsh winter of disillusionment and struggle, but had emerged stronger and more beautiful for the experience. The future stretched before her like an unwritten page, ready to be filled with new adventures, deeper love, and continued service to the cause of justice that had become her life's calling. Her story had become more than a personal triumph. It had become a testament to the power of moral courage to transform not just individual lives but entire societies. The bride who had smiled and delivered her groom to the royal guard at the altar had done more than prevent one man's escape from justice. She had helped awaken a nation to the possibility of a more just and equitable future for all its citizens.